the webinar. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Crystalyn Partica, and I am the project manager for the Northern Grapes Project. Today's webinar is comparing and contrasting vertical shoot positioning and top wire cordon training systems with Tim Martinson, John Toole, and Bob Etter. Tim is a Senior Extension Associate at Cornell University, and he runs the statewide viticulture extension program. He also directs the Northern Grapes Project, so Tim's my boss, so be nice to him. John is a vineyard manager at the University of Minnesota Horticultural Research Center. In that role, he's gained a lot of experience with all the different grape training systems out there, and he's going to share some of his knowledge with us today. Bob owns Flying Otter Vineyard and Winery in Adrian, Michigan, and has been growing cold hardy hybrids there for 10 years now. He's invested a lot of time into determining which training systems work best at his location for each cultivar, and he's going to share some of that knowledge with us. Remember that as a participant in the webinar today, we need to ask you to keep your microphones muted if you have one. If you're having any technical difficulties or you have questions for the speakers, please use the chat pod in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. We're going to take breaks in between each of the three presentations for questions, and then we will have time at the end as well, obviously. So let me give Tim control of the slides. And Tim, I will let you give your presentation. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you could join us today. We've just got about a foot of snow dumped on us, and I was out yesterday with a class going out and trundling out to some sites for to collect some soil samples. So that was an interesting challenge. So the topic today is comparing and contrasting vertical shoot positioning and top wire cordon. And I want to state at the outset that either of these systems, if well done, can produce good marketable quantities of high quality fruit. So I don't want to take sides on whether one is always better or the other. And I think a lot of it depends on your site characteristics. So what I want to do today is just briefly go through some of the cost of production studies that we've done here in New York, just very briefly, and talk about some of the issues and how you have to justify any hand operation that involves a significant amount of labor in the vineyard. And then I want to share briefly some information from our training system trials in Northern New York. I'm going to concentrate on Marquette from 2013. Some of you might have heard this already before, but I think it's kind of relevant to the discussion today. So I'll try and go quickly here, and so we can get through all the presentations. So first of all, choosing a training system, really there's 2 or 3 things that are important. First of all, you want a system that will produce a profitable and marketable number of yields. Most growers get paid by the ton, and payments for quality premiums tend to be a little bit less. But of course, the quality is important. Does it produce optimum ripeness at harvest? And our methods of measuring this are a little bit imperfect. I'm going to concentrate on Brix pH and TA here, but of course there's some other things involved. And with the University of Minnesota cultivars, it's very important to manage acidity. But the third one, which I think is very relevant to this discussion, is how much does it cost to do all this stuff? And the cost is both measured in time and money. If you have lots of hand labor items, are you going to have time to do them all in the acreage that you have? And of course, the money to pay the labor. So I like to show this slide, and I'm just to illustrate what we're trying to do when we manage vines. So basically, we have vines in a box. Each vine has a space. And within that space, we're trying to measure the vigor and the shoot density and avoiding overall overshading or lack of trellis fill in that. So we have a lot of tools, including vine spacing when you set up the vineyard, the training system, and then a number of other things like canopy management, crop management, and irrigation to to manage that. And a lot depends on your soils. So, and you can't really choose your soils. So basically, soils vary in depth, texture, water holding capacity, organic matter, and fertility. So all this ties into the root system and how big it gets and how that impacts the growth on the top. So all those things impact the vigor, which is defined as the rate of shoot growth, the vine capacity, sustainable cropping level, and it's up to growers to manage the crop load to really cope with that. And so I guess the message is that one size doesn't necessarily fit all when we're talking about training systems. I just wanted to run through annual growing cost per acre and just to make the point here that if we look on vinifera, basically materials, annual materials that you apply, pesticides and so forth, that accounts to about 19-20% of the costs, equipment costs, about 19%. But the big one is labor. That represents 62% of the annual growing costs. If we look at fixed costs per acre, that is a big thing as well. According to our numbers, if you do that on 50 acres, that amounts to about $1,400 an acre. Of course, if you spread those fixed costs over fewer acres, then you still have roughly the same fixed costs, but fewer acres to spread it over. So that impacts things. If you look on VSP at the details of this, pruning accounts for about a quarter, tying another 15%. But canopy management, the things that you do like shoot thinning, shoot positioning, cluster thinning, leaf removal, and summer hedging, that amounts to about 30% of the labor hours per acre. So that's a very significant cost. We machine harvest around here, so the harvesting costs, whether it be hand or machine, aren't included in these figures. So if we look at top wire cordon, then we see that there are things that you do to VSP that you don't have to do to top wire cordon, and so the labor costs tend to be about 30% lower. So that's one consideration that in my mind is a very important one. If we look at individual practices, each time you do a pass through the vineyard for manual manipulation of the vines, there are costs involved. And shoot thinning is one of the most cost-effective things you can do in terms of canopy management. That really sets the vines up for the optimum shoot density right at the beginning of the season. If you do it at this growth stage that you see on the slide, it goes relatively fast, and you can do it at probably a slow walking speed. But while you're removing those shoots, you are also removing some of the crop. So basically, the cost of doing this is the time it takes. And we estimated this at about 3.3 hours per acre. I actually timed these guys going down a row and tried to figure out how long it would take for them to cover an acre. And then you are also reducing the crop because you're removing clusters. So if we're looking at half a ton lower yield, you're looking at lower receipts for it. So in essence, if you do this procedure, you have to hope that you can wring more quality out of it. So what you really need to justify this practice is $800 per acre more in quality, because you're going to have a little less fruit to sell, and you hope that that can come out in better quality wine or higher bottle price or whatever. So that's just one way of thinking about that, and this is just one of many hand operations that people do in the vineyards. Okay, I want to turn now to our training system trials, because that was really one of our objectives when we set up the Northern Grapes Project. I'm working at a vineyard up in northern New York, Coyote Moon Vineyards. It's about a 5- or 6-year-old vineyard in the year I'm talking about. So here we set up a training trial where we did comparison of vertical shoot positioning, top wire cordon, and cane pruned umbrella niffin. So really, In terms of canopy management, with VSP, we're talking about a mid-wire cordon, doing shoot positioning a few times, doing shoot tipping probably 2 or 3 times a season, basal, cluster zone, leaf removal, and I call that my intensive canopy management. On the top wire system, we trained them to a high cordon, and the only real other, aside from shoot thinning, because we put these all in a standard shoot density, the only thing we did was shoot combing in the middle of the season, probably a little bit later than you'd want to do it. So I call that moderate canopy management. On the umbrella nippon, just was 3 or 4 long canes arched and tied to the middle wire, and we didn't do anything else to manage the canopy there. So this is how they looked on in June of that year, May, June, and then a little later on in the growing season in August. Wanted to just briefly show you a before and after slide of shoot combing with front neck, before and after, and you can see on the right side, the after shot, that some of the canopies, some of the clusters are exposed. It still is a fairly dense canopy there, but there's partial exposure of the clusters there, and we did that a little bit right around the time of veraison. So probably could have done this a little bit earlier. Okay. So I want to share with you yield data from 2013. We set this up in 2012. That was sort of a transition year, but here's what we found in our Marquette blocks. If we looked at yield, we got 2.3 tons per acre on the VSP, 4.3 on the top wire cordon, 5 in the umbrella. Again, 7 to 16 pounds per vine. And that was quite a significant difference. In essence, we yielded twice as much on the high wire training systems than on the VSP. I want to go through the yield components, because this is relevant at all. What contributed to the lower yields? Well, there are fewer clusters per vine. You can see that in the red bars and in the table. Clusters weighed less in the VSP than in the other 2 systems. There were fewer berries per cluster, and there was lower berry weight. So this is a little bit rare to see all these changes with consistently lower numbers for all the yield components on the VSP. And the umbrella did yield more, but it had about 4 more shoots per vine. So when we look at the yield per shoot, divide this yield by this number, then we see that basically the 2 TWC and the umbrella had the same yield per shoot, whereas the VSP had, again, about half as much yield per shoot. Okay, so that's yield, and here's just a shot of both in 2013 from our trials, and then in 2014, a little bit earlier on in the season, just showing the differences in cluster size there. And this is just a couple of individual tray shots from individual reps of that vine, and you can see the umbrella nippon and the smaller clusters and the lower yield in the VSP in this situation. So how did this impact fruit composition? Well, the biggest impact we saw really from having twice as much crop on the top wire systems is that our Brix were higher, significantly higher on the VSP with half the crop. So they were at about 27 versus 25.5. And the pH turned out slightly higher. But I want you to note that even with half the crop level on these vines, that the titratable acidity curves were basically indistinguishable. So having twice as much crop had no real impact on the titratable acidity curves and how fast those dropped in the fall. On front neck, I'm just, similar trends, but I just wanted to show you that, again, with the titratable acidity on the front neck, basically we had the same trends and no big differences according to the training system. So this year we went out and I decided at harvest to harvest a little extra fruit. We went to 6 different vines, and from each of those vines I picked 5 exposed clusters and 5 shaded clusters. This is within a single vine, and we did individual measurements of Brix, pH, and titratable acidity there. Just to get at the shaded versus exposed item. And so here's what it looks like with the Brix on the exposed clusters. The Brix at harvest were 24.0. From the same vines, again, they averaged 21.8, so significantly higher Brix on the exposed clusters. pH 3.25 versus 3.28, a slight difference there on the shaded clusters, but pretty close within the same vine. But look here at the titratable acidity, again, 11 grams per liter on this shaded clusters, that's the red, and then about 1.5 lower titratable acidity on the exposed clusters. So this suggests to me that really the most important goal that you need to look at when you're managing your vines is not necessarily which particular shading training system you have, but whether the clusters have significant sunlight exposure. And this is just the same data, and I'm just going to go through this because it shows on each of those individual vines, each blue box there represents one vine in shaded exposed versus shaded clusters. So you can see on each of those 6 vines then with clusters from the same vine, Brix were significantly higher on the exposed versus the shaded clusters. And if we look at titratable acidity, we saw that again, the titratable acidity was lower on the exposed versus the shaded clusters, with the exception of this 6th vine there, which something happened to. Okay, so so from our trials here, we found out that on Marquette in that particular season, the cropping level affected the total soluble solids. The Brix is about 2 degrees higher on vines that were carrying less than half the crop, but they were still up at 25.5 Brix, so that seems like a fairly ripe level. When we reduced the crop, that didn't really have any impact on the titratable acidity overall. But then when I went and drilled down into the individual clusters, we saw that the exposed clusters had the higher Brix and lower titratable acidity, regardless of what the training system was. So I guess my overall message here is it's important to manage the vines so that you provide light exposure to the cluster. If you, whatever system you choose, if you manage it poorly, you're going to get poor results. But if you are able to put in the time to manage it and to do all the proper things to provide this light exposure, you're going to come out with better quality fruit. Okay, and I didn't measure flavor or tannin differences. We didn't make wine out of this, but we are planning on doing that here in the final year of the project. So I'm going to stop there. Chrislyn, do we want to do questions yet, or do we want to go right to John?
Let's go ahead and do some questions. So you already addressed the flavor and tannin differences. We didn't notice any. Eric asked, I noticed that during 2013, Frontenac Brix didn't appear to be significantly higher. Do you have any ideas as to why that is?
Yeah, and I didn't go through the Frontenac data in part because the differences were a lot less dramatic and many of them weren't statistically significant. So I think the two of them responded a little differently to this. But we still did see the difference, and some data I didn't show was from Frontenac in 2013, where we did a similar thing with the exposed clusters versus the shaded clusters across the training systems, and we did see the same differences in titratable acidity and in bricks.
Okay. I've noticed several questions come in, guys, and I'm going to answer these in the chat pod while John is talking, so keep your eye out for those, because I've worked on these trials too, so I can address those. But I do want to ask one, Tim. Mark Hart asks, so cluster exposure would probably also translate into earlier ripening?
Yes. Yes. And I think, I don't know what to say exactly here, but if your clusters are exposed to sunlight, they're going to be warmer, and the activity of the enzymes and so forth, and the respiration. So the malic acid is going to be respired more if the clusters are warmer. So that certainly ties into it. With the cluster exposure. So.
Okay. All right. Well, Tim, thank you. I am going to take care of the other questions that came in so that we can keep the webinar going on. John, I will let you unmute your microphone and start your presentation if you'd like.
All right. Thank you, Chrislyn. Everybody can hear me clear?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, well, I was asked to do this talk because I am in favor of VSP for a lot of things, but not for everything. And of course, like Tim had mentioned, there's a reason and a time for each different system. So I could just as easily write a talk for high Cordon. I mean, I like both systems, but today we're gonna look on the bright side of VSP, so to speak, and try to point out some of the positives. And we'll talk about some of the negatives as well. Oops. Okay. So to start out with, these are the points that I really want to cover throughout this talk. Basically, for me, the VSP, the fruit zone and your work zones are in really nice ergonomic position, you know, you're kind of at that hip height where it's nice and easy to work. The upward tendency of young shoots early in the growing season on a lot of varieties seems to naturally fit VSP because they do want to go up in the early, it's not till later when they get heavy and they do drape down. I also think that good fruit exposure and cane ripening can take place on VSP. You got the nice narrow canopies that dry faster from rain and dew. And effective spray coverage then also helps lower the disease pressure. And shorter trunks are a little bit easier to keep clean for me and keep them straight also, which is pretty important when you're doing all kinds of, whether it's mowing or spraying or any other mechanical job in the vineyard. Then you also get the good airflow benefit of having the shoots up and out of the way, and then the floor is easy to keep clean when those shoots are not hanging in the way. And many of the tasks that we do as far as summer canopy management can be mechanized through the VSP. There's a certain amount of mechanization that can go on with high Cordon as well, but VSP really lends itself to mechanizing. So you can get some labor-saving incentive there. Retraining the vine structure is also a little bit faster after a cold injury. So if your trunks do die down, you can get them up and running and fruiting a little bit sooner, it seems like, on VSP. And then harvest is fun for everybody, whether they're kids or adults. I think it's a nice zone to be harvesting fruit. But on the drawbacks, not all varieties have this upright tendency. And wires, adding all the extra VSP wires adds to the cost of installation. A lot of tendril-prone varieties are very hard to pull out of the catch wires, so that's a big labor thing. Upright training can excessively increase the shoot vigor in certain situations, and then I think that's a lot where that lower yield starts to take part too. So you have this competition between vegetative and reproductive growth going on, and the reproductive growth, the fruit formation essentially is lowered in those situations. And fruit predation by raccoons can also increase. One thing I didn't mention is a drawback. We talked, maybe Bob will cover it a little bit more about the stratification of temperatures. So sometimes you get a little more frost-prone injury at the VSP height, but then on the benefit side of that, you can get some reflection from the ground and maybe heat those clusters up a little more in certain cases. But The biggest note I want to make is that VSP is not recommended for procumbent varieties, that is the varieties that like to hang down and grow down. And then also on like fertile soils, you don't really want to go with VSP as much because it only increases the vigor of the vine, and fertile soils are going to increase that enough. So high cordons or split canopies can devigorate those vines to an extent. All right, just a quick shot of what a VSP would look like, just for everybody's the vertical shoot position training. We all know this, I think, for the most part. Fruit zone nice and low there. This is what your catch wires would look like in there, and some of the heights and specs. So I'll let people peruse this on their own. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we have a couple of slides I want to get through and a lot of important points on each one. So that's what that Frontenac, for example, Frontenac Gris or the whole Frontenac family could look like at that 40-inch fruit height. These are fairly young vines, so there's some openness in the canopy yet, but as they grow in, they'll get a little bit more full, in fact. I do like the spur pruning method for the VSP. It's very comfortable and seems to be quick. This is a little bit tight spur pruning in this case, but in certain years it works. Other years you can leave a little bit more spurs or do some other things, but it's at a nice height for working if you're hand pruning. Certain varieties are very naturally vertical. You can see here's even a cane pruned shoot. This is on a high wire system, but these shoots are very much wanting to go upward. So if they had catch wires, they would maybe like to keep continuing to grow into those. And if you don't have that necessarily, I mean, you can choose your spurs to be in a very upright position. In this case, the spurs that are upright were saved, and anything that was pointing down, they were cut off or diminished pretty severely on this Marquette photo. Oh, there we go. Did I? Yeah. The one thing I wanted to make a point of is the gravitropism of those young shoots, the tendency for them to go upward or oppose gravity. It's just the roots go down with gravity and the shoots go up against gravity. And you'll often see this in the springtime with many varieties. I see it in, for example, the crescent and everything. They first want to go up, but when they get weight on the shoots, then they'll hang down. So even though I spur pruned this guy down, the shoots are very much wanting to go up in the beginning of the season. You just have to decide over time if your soil is a little bit more vigorous, maybe that's what determines whether you go VSP or high cordon, because even in this case of the vine, these shoots are very upright right now, but if we let them grow another couple inches or even feet, they're definitely going to be hanging down nicely. So the big determiner for me is soil vigor or soil fertility. Because as we stated earlier, procumbent vines will not want to work well with you in VSP. Brianna and Edelweiss are these kind of varieties. They got this sideways slant growth. It's just, they don't prefer to go upward. They would rather trail and go down. What I often see though is the fruit and the wood ripening does seem to hasten or hurry up on the VSP if you've got that good exposure in that fruit zone. So this is an example of what that can look like. As we know, during the fall, this wood ripening, this paraderm development is happening because of carbohydrates being allocated to this, and it does stop after a hard frost. So you can see there the shot where the paraderm has stopped. And high cordon vines, they definitely, I would agree that they can yield more in many situations and make just as good a quality fruit. You have to understand your soil fertility and water availability for this to make these decisions. But you will want to be careful of the cane ripening because sometimes that may suffer on certain situations when you overcrop. So we're not only trying to ripen that fruit as nice as possible, we're trying to look forward to the future and make sure that that wood is ripened nice for the next year as well. Otherwise, we're compromising next year's crop. The crop load on Marquette on VSP is, I would say it is generally lower, like the results are showing. So I've been kicking around some ideas. Do we do canes or spurs with this guy? Which way can we find to make it better? Traditionally, a lot of wine grapes and table grapes, they seem to produce a little bit more out of those canes rather than from the spurs. So what I thought, maybe I was going to try this in my own field, where I would try 2 parallel canes, for example, or maybe a cordon with a cane split slightly apart to increase that yield. The shot just shows a picture of a cordon train marquette on VSP. But here's what I had seen when I had visited out in Pennsylvania. Paul Milnes, he's got a lot of vinifera and the hybrids, and I saw this 2 canes laid really close together, and I thought that was a pretty neat idea. I'd give that a try to increase the production on some of these. So if you're in a situation of VSP already and you're looking for a way to make more crop, I think this would be one thing that would be worth trying. The Frontenac family seems to be pretty highly yielding already, no matter what you're doing. Spurs, the basal buds, everything seems to throw out fruit plenty. So I think they have a pretty nice crop on VSP at my own vineyard anyway. Le Crescent seems to love hanging in the sun, so VSP seems to work well with that guy at my place. But again, I'm not recommending these varieties go on VSP when you're on a high vigor, high fertility soil site. And here, high cordon, I think generally it does need a little bit more leaf pulling, and the shoot positioning seems to be needed just a little bit earlier. So if you can get that job done earlier, you can avoid some of these green fruit situations, and you'll get a lot better flavor profiles coming out of that system if the leaves are out of the way sooner. Now the VSP, it seems, we've talked about that, the shoots seem to harden off, but you want to see that natural senescence, that natural leaf color change in the vines. It just means good carbohydrate reserves are building for hardiness. And high cordon vines, just to illustrate that they can really devigorate the vines. It's a nice shot there. I really like that. That's what we're going for when we're doing high cordon. But sometimes the high cordon can get you into this pitfall of a very wide and shady crop. So you got to be careful to avoid this situation at all costs. Because what's only happening then is you're just creating a lot of dense, disease-prone zone in the center. So your fruit is going to be exposed to a lot of rot inside. The narrow open canopies of VSP, they can dry out a little bit faster. That's one good benefit, I feel. And the spraying is also a lot more effective than when you've got good spray penetration into that fruit zone. It keeps your vines cleaner and healthier in the long term. You can see how tight they're actually held together with those catch wires where Jenny is pruning. The high wire systems, that you have to have a nice sturdy support stake. If you don't, you get these curly trunks over the years, and it's not that you can't fix them, but they do get to be in the way of equipment over time. So just one little point there, making sure you have nice sturdy supports. Here's that shorter trunk of the VSP. It's got maybe a lot less work to keep those suckers cleaned off of there versus an extra couple 3 or 4 feet of trunk on the high cordon system. Shoots are up and out of the way, so you have good airflow, and you have also easier weed control. You can see the floor is pretty easy to clean and manage down there in this shot. Sunny grapes are happy grapes. I just kind of threw that in there to remind us how nice this can be in a cold and snowy winter afternoon here. The vineyard management schedule, so there's a lot of things that we're doing during the season, and what I wanted to illustrate is that a lot of these jobs can be mechanized, and every effort that we make in the vineyard is toward high quality fruit, right? So if we're going to make a decision to do pre-pruning, this is an option. It can save time and labor, especially on this VSP type situation. You can also do some shoot and desuckering, shoot thinning, desuckering with mechanical scrubbers. The shoot tucking can be mechanized to an extent. I don't know if people have seen this so much, but there's these machines called shoot binders or Laubhefters. It's a pretty cool thing. I've seen it in Germany, and some people are kicking it around, maybe out on the West Coast, but that is an option. It's not going to be 100% perfect, but it is going to save some labor there. Shoots, They need to be trimmed, of course, when they outgrow the top, but you've got a trimmer for that job. And you want to do that before the shoots lean or blow over. Mechanical leaf removal is totally possible. You've got this nice fruit zone then exposed. Now this is a shot of La Crescent being hand leaf pulled, but not to say that you can't do that with a mechanical leaf deleafing system. You need to determine then in each situation how many leaves do you really want to remove. Some varieties really respond well to it. Others need a little bit more shading. You're always trying to avoid that sunburn though. That's a critical thing. And you're going to have sunburn issues on fruit exposure on high cordon and VSP no matter what. The shoots, they should ultimately try to reach 15 nodes in either situation of VSP or high cordon. They should be about 4.5 feet in length is what we're going for. But in those certain years when you can't control everything, the weather sometimes throws you a loop and you've got to retrain your vines from the ground up. This was our La Crescent in central Minnesota. Some of our vines look like this, probably the worst ones, not all of them. But we were in the situation a couple years ago and we kept multiple trunks coming up that season when we needed to regrow, and the following season we were back into this kind of production. So I feel you're in production with VSP just a little bit faster. And here's a shot of a vinifera that we grow. It's not hardy in Minnesota, but when we do lay 2 canes down doubled up on top of each other, we get some phenomenal yields that way on a good year. And so high quality wines really need that high quality fruit, and that's what we're going for. No matter what we're doing, every system and every variety that we're growing, we're always trying to produce the best quality fruit that we can, right? So sun exposure, I feel, is the big key in all of that. And then on top of that, the quality of wood ripening is also needed. So not only is it important to get that fruit ripened, but we got to get that wood just as ripe for next season so we have good production again. Just like they sang in the 60s, right? Let the sun shine in. That's what we want to see. So for everybody out there, I guess just try to understand your soil's potential for growing vines. Try to learn the nuances of each variety before you actually plant and decide on trellis. Weigh your time and labor costs against ripening and quality benefits. And closely watch and record how your vines react to your pruning methods and cultural practices. And then definitely adjust as needed on your particular site. So with that, I just want to acknowledge the folks that I work with out at the University of Minnesota here, my wife Jenny Toole, Peter Hempstead, the breeder, Dr. Jim Luby, he's our director of fruit breeding out here, and then our laborers of this past season, Matt Erickson, Alana Robinson, and Randy Kimball. It's a pretty good team. It's a lot of fun. So, and I want to thank you all for tuning in today. Here's just a shot how everybody's really happy at harvest time. My little son Mason there. So. All right, thank you.
All right. Yes, we have a few questions. Eric asked, if you run into the situation where your high cordon vines have become dense and wide, what are your options to further devigor those vines?
Oh, that is a good question. Well, we're trying to keep more shoots, more buds, and more fruit is one way of devigorating, but then sometimes that is a catch-22 because it just makes more dense canopy, right? So I don't know if you can divide the canopy anymore. If you want to try to start moving toward a Geneva double curtain system, it's a lot of work to retrofit trellising, but that's an option out there. Another option is maybe ripping up the roots on one side of the vines where you actually help devigorate the vines that way. So the roots don't pump so much energy up from the ground, you know, maybe rip one side of the vine 1 year and then a couple years later you rip the other side. That may help. I haven't tried it myself, but I know there's practices that do that.
I guess depending on how close the spacing is, you could think about taking some vines out, couldn't you, if you think
Correct.
You can fill in the gap?
Definitely. That would allow you to spit more buds and more shoots and fruit on a single vine by spacing that vine in a longer span along the trellis. So taking every other vine out, for example, would help do that.
All right. Patrick asks, have you experimented with using trellis post extenders with VSP to achieve a taller canopy? And have you heard anything good or bad about them? And Tim answered a little bit there that they don't work well. Do you have any experience with them, John?
I've seen them installed, and that's again to put a little metal extender on a wood post seems to be a lot of work for kind of little benefit, but I don't know. And then they generally will break down over time because the wood is going to rot, and that is taking the brunt of the winds up top there. So I don't really like the extender idea unless it's something that really is you feel sturdier and going to fit on your post. It's just best to put a longer post in to begin with. And I know if you're in that situation where, well, now I want to extend, you can get away with it and do it, but boy, it's a lot of extra work again. You may as well almost try to like move into the high cordon system then, and then grow your shoots from the top down versus going through all the work of putting an extender on, I think.
Okay. Tim then asked about question about periderm formation. So if you prune to 3 to 4 nodes first, and the canes only harden off to 8 or 9 nodes instead of 12, does it really make any difference? Because the nodes that you have kept are still hardened off.
Right. Yep, that's true. The nodes that you're keeping in that situation are hardened off. But if you're seeing canes that are not really well ripened, that's indicative then that your vine is really not adequately hardening off its entire system for the coming winter. So you don't. Yeah, you can get away with it. You can probably still spur prune and get good fruit in the next season. But the further we go north, like where I'm at, it's an indication to me that I'm really pushing that vine a little bit too far, and I should scale back the fruit a little bit and maybe the shoots, or get those guys exposed better and make sure that they can also harden off that wood, because the same carbohydrates are getting fed to the fruit that are needed for the hardening off and the wood ripening. So we've got to balance that out nicely between both.
All right. Well, that's all the questions that you had for now. So I am going to go ahead and turn things over to Bob to let him get started. And John, thank you very much. If you want to hang around, we might have some more questions at the end. Bob,
Will do.
I will let you get started. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to present a lot of anecdotal information from my own small family-run vineyard and winery. I look to Tim and John for all this wonderful research and the hard numbers, but what I'm going to talk about is really just my experience in the vineyard. So a little bit of background history. We have an 8-acre family owned and operated vineyard and winery here in southeast Michigan. Everything we do is by hand. There's very little automation. We planted Frontenac vines in 2005. It was obvious the second year that those needed to be on GDC because of the vigor we had. In 2004, when I was trying to decide what kind of trellis to use for Frontenac, I called a couple of growers that had some experience and asked them, is it procumbent or upright or down growing, or what kind of trellis they used, and their answer was Frontenac pretty much wants to grow all over. And that's been my experience, and that's part of the reason that I went with high wire cordon and split the canopy with Geneva double curtain. So we added Frontenac Gris vines in 2006 and Frontenac Blanc vines in 2010, and everything with Frontenac in its name is on GDC. Pretty much everything else we grow is on a single high wire cordon. So, but I didn't start out that way. I planted some Lacrosse, Lacrescent, St. Pepin, and Brianna in 2006 and started with VSP and converted to the single high wire in 2011, so after 5 years. And along that same 5 years, just so you get a feel for the, what we can grow in my particular location, Traminette, Foch and Limburger were tried and removed because they just weren't hardy enough. After 3 years or 4 years, I was still having a lot of vines trying to start over from the ground, and I just gave up on those and went with hardier varieties. And so then we added Marquette and Petite Pearl, and I started those on the single high wire. All of this for the following reasons. Advantages in order of priority based on my experience at my particular location. Reduced varmint predation. I just have, my vineyard, 8 acres, is surrounded on 2 sides by woods, and I just have a lot of wildlife pressure, particularly from raccoons and some from possums. And in my experience, getting the vines or getting the fruiting zone as high off of the ground as possible really helps that situation. I do trapping and baiting then for the raccoons, and that's down on the ground, and I've just found that to be really successful at keeping the raccoons out of my trellis. I saw someone earlier ask a question about turkeys, and yes, I think that low wire or lower wire of the cordon is really at a pretty ideal height for the turkeys to just walk down the row and help themselves. And so I've found that really I don't get any problems or losses to turkeys with the high wire cordon. And we've already touched several times on reduced labor, and I don't have any hard statistics, but I know from my experience that going from VSP to high wire really saves me a lot of time. I spent a lot in the early days trying to train the vines. I spent way too much time tucking vines. I don't think the hybrids are as well behaved as a lot of the other upright growth. John and Tim both showed some beautiful pictures of spur-pruned vines with upgrowing shoots. After several years, I was never able to attain that in my own vines. It seems I would pick out, spurs and buds that I wanted to be upgrowing, and the next year when you come back and prune, there's a bunch growing out to the side and growing down, and I just was not very successful with that, and it was very time consuming. And then we also, you've already seen mentioned the tenacious tendrils. Pruning with trying to get all those shoots that you're pruning off out of the catch wires, I again found that very time consuming, very labor intensive, and very frustrating. And all of those issues in terms of reduced labor are much improved with the high wire. And of course, we've already mentioned, if you don't have catch wires, you do save some money with in material costs to construct the trellis. Frost protection. 4 out of the last 5 years, I've had late spring frost damage in my vineyard. And I noticed that in the early days, my rows are about 300 feet long, and at one end of the row, it might be 2 to 3 feet lower in elevation. And at that low end, I could see 100% bud loss, and at the high end, 0% bud loss. So obviously, a few feet can make a huge difference in bud survivability with a late spring frost event. So with that in mind, I added a cold drain in 2014 because I wanted as much elevation margin as I could get so that I could drain that cold air. So for the, even if you don't have a cold air drain, the further away from the ground you can get, the better you're going to be able to survive a late spring frost event. And in my case, using the cold air drain, it just gives me more margin to drain that cold air out of the vineyard and help those buds survive, or young shoots survive. So this is a photo of the Sure Farms, a cold air drain, just a huge fan that blows air vertically up. And if you, on the right is a picture taken standing right at that cold air drain and looking up into my vineyard, and it just naturally all drains down to this one spot. So I just added this last year. Last spring was the only chance I had to use it on one night. I was concerned with draining, trying to drain 8 acres, whether or not that cold air would build up and cause a lot of damage. And again, anecdotally, this is only one night, but when I did use it, there was no frost on the ground in the vineyard, and the frost down around this huge vertical fan was really thick on the grass. So it's obvious that it was allowing the cold air to drain down out of the vineyard. Disadvantages. Grape exposure to birds. My experience is I didn't see a whole lot of difference. I think it depends on whether or not the birds get the idea that your vineyard is a source of food, and they're certainly capable of finding the grapes if that's the case. So in the early days, I had a lot of trouble with damage and loss to birds, and I've added a lot of scare devices and been fairly successful at trying to keep them out of the vineyard that way. And I haven't seen that going to high wire versus VSP really made that situation worse. Sunshine, grape ripeness, I totally agree that grapes like sun and that helps ripen them. But given all of those advantages I went through, I think in my particular location, I'm not disappointed with the ability to ripen the grapes. I just put in some information here. I won't go over all of it in a lot of detail. The Frontenac, which are 10-year-old vines now, and I've pretty well, I think, zeroed in on what's a sustainable crop load, and that's around 8 tons per acre. So this past year, my harvest ranged from 4 tons per acre to almost 12 tons per acre on the Frontenac Blanc. Probably a little heavy on the Frontenac Blanc, but we'll see next year how well those vines come back. And you can see from the Brix numbers that, generally speaking, I'm pleased with how well we're able to ripen those grapes at those crop levels. Here's one I hadn't anticipated. In hindsight, I probably should have, and I know John mentioned it. When you go to high wire, it does create more of a bending moment on those posts, more of a load that's going to try to pull that end post out of the ground. You can see that I used a fairly short H brace, and these end posts we're looking at here, those are the ones that are about 10 years old, and you can see they're all starting to pick up a little bit of a lean. And my plan is that at some point I'm going to have to go back in and put in anchors and pull those back, or at least keep them from tipping further. And all work, if you're doing a high wire, all work is overhead. So John showed the photo of his son picking grapes, and my grandkids would love to do that, but they just can't because they can't reach it. So that's a definite disadvantage. So on those vines where I started out with the VSP and then made the decision to convert to a high wire cordon, those vines were 5 years old. I selected the 2 strongest shoots and took those up to the top wire and cut off everything else. I was anticipating that doing that, I'd see a really large yield reduction until I was able to reestablish those cordons. But it wasn't as much as I expected. I'd say the first year I got at least half of a normal crop, and by the second year it was back to normal. I also anticipated that where I cut off the cordons and had that big knob in the trunk, that I'd have a lot of problem with additional suckers. In the first year, there were a lot that I have to go through and just rub off. The second year, there were fewer. The third year and beyond, it's really been no problem at all. So here's you know, some examples of what it looks like, and in some cases they're pretty gnarly looking, because again, I just selected the longest shoot that I could find, the strongest, longest shoot, and ran that up to the top wire to form the cordon. So here's one on the left where you know, you can see there's quite a bit of the cordon left before I came to a shoot that I took up. Whereas on the one in the middle, there's very little of the original cordon left, and there were some strong shoots closer to the original trunk that I took up to form the cordons. And on the one on the right, the cordons and the shoots were such that I could just bend them up and maintain the original cordons and just run them up to the top wire. So that kind of covers all my anecdotal experience, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right, we don't have any so far, but we could have a few more come in. And if you guys have questions for Tim or me or John or whoever, go ahead and enter them. We still have some time left, so questions, guys. A lot of times when people are listening, they tend to not send questions, and then we get a whole flurry right as the speaker finishes up. So I am going to go ahead and, while we're waiting for questions to come in, let me go ahead and become the presenter again. I'm going to go ahead and take the time to put up the schedule for the remaining webinars. We have 2 more this season, March 10th with Anna Catherine Mansfield talking about tannins, and April 14th with Bill Gartner talking about the branding studies. So Tom asked which cost for more netting? Tom, can you clarify that? I don't think I quite understand what you mean. And then Beth Workmaster asked John if you can describe pre-pruning. So John, if you're still there and want to unmute your microphone.
Sure. Pre-pruning, there's certain machines that are available that you can actually pre-prune these vines, and it gets the bulk of the material, it pulls the bulk of the canes out of your, for example, your VSP trellis for you, and then you just have to go back and do some fine pruning if you wish. I mean, there's even some places that don't even go back. They do sort of a real rough cut prune, and then that's the way they go, but not recommending that by any means. It's just nice to, it does the job of pulling the canes out of the catch wires for you, essentially. These barrel type pruners or these pre-pruners, these mechanical pruners. All right. Any more on that?
I think that'll be good. Then Tom clarified his question if bird netting cost is more for VSP versus top wire.
I'd be willing to weigh in on that. With the over-the-row nets that you know, go over the canopy and then tie down, I don't think you'd see any big difference, because most of that involves, you know, putting it on. I'm imagining that putting it on and tying it up and the labor would be about the same. But on VSP, you can do a sort of a cluster zone netting that doesn't extend over the entire canopy, and so that's so that would probably be, you know, cheaper if you're able to use the side zone netting.
Okay, and Patrick asked if there's any data out there related to this netting issue, data on the labor costs and material costs.
Not to my awareness, Patrick. I know Alice Wise has done a lot of work with netting, but everything is on VSP on Long Island, pretty much. Definitely the side netting is cheaper to apply. Unfortunately, on Long Island, they have such huge bird pressure that some people are actually going to double netting because the birds learn and they're able to net, get through the older types of netting. I don't think there's probably a simple answer to this, but I've seen it on both types of training systems, and I think the costs are fairly comparable for the over the trellis netting.
Can I quick mention on with VSP though, you have to be careful that your fruit zone isn't without too much leaves, because it can be a point where the wind will actually push the net into the clusters sometimes. I've seen that. And then the birds are able to cling to the net and hang on and peck those berries. And even raccoons then get in there even more. So there's that thing to consider. Generally, high cordon vines, their shoots are holding the net up a little bit more, and then the fruit is away from the net. So that is one benefit of I've seen in the high cordon netting versus VSP netting.
Yes, and on Long Island, just to add to that, they do tend to do complete removal around the cluster zone, so the clusters are hanging out there naked.
Okay, Bob, someone asked you how high your VSP vines are trained.
The top wire is at 6 feet. That's what I build the trellis to.
Okay.
Oh, VSP? When I had VSP, you mean? Or
what did she say? I accidentally deleted the question. Anyway, well, I guess let's go ahead and answer your VSP too.
Yeah, so. when I had VSP, the cordon wire was at about 32 inches, and then I moved that up to 6 feet.
Okay. All right. Then Martin asked, how many vines per acre on the high wire? And honestly, just for me answering that, I would, and the others can chime in too, I think that you need to take into consideration what your cultivar is and also how vigorous your site is. It's not something that you can really easily answer without that kind of information too. Would somebody else like to chime in on that as well? Tim, John, anybody?
It's definitely a soil. Yeah, it's the fertility of the soil is going to determine how far you're going to spread your vines out. So it could be as little as 600 vines per acre, and it can get up to in the thousands depending on how meager your soil might be. So high cordon and GDC vines are going to be definitely fewer vines per acre, down in that 600 or 700 range.
Yeah, 9x8 would be 605 vines per acre. Yes, and I think the choice there is regardless of your vine spacing, the vines want to put out a similar amount of growth, and it can channel it into fewer shoots, and then they're going to be bigger shoots and longer shoots, or they can channel it into more shoots, which will be shorter shoots. And with more shoots, then you probably are going to have more clusters and a better balanced vines. So if you have vigorous vines, you're going to want to space them farther apart because that will give you better results than if you have tight spacing and vines that want to go crazy and be huge vines. Because if you prune them severely, then you're just going to end up with lots of very long, very wide canes, and more potential for shading and so forth. So I'm a big believer in adjusting the vine spacing to accommodate the vigor in the soil. It's hard to know sometimes up front what that exact number should be.
Yeah, so Martin clarified his question about the number of vines per acre. Bob, he was asking you specifically how many vines per acre you have.
I've planted everything 10-foot rows with 7-foot vine spacing, and that's because I just don't have the experience to know what would be best for each variety. For the Geneva double curtain, that's worked out really well. For a couple of the white varieties like La Crosse and La Crescent, that's worked out really well. Like for my Boreana, that's probably too close. It's too vigorous. So, you know, it really depends on the site and the variety. But all of mine is 10-foot rows, 7-foot vine spacing.
Okay. Vanessa asked, can you kindly clarify why the high wire is better for vigorous vines? Somebody want to?
High wire. Well, the downward growth of the shoot, just because of the way the plants, you know, the plant hormones in there are situated, that it seems to devigorate. It seems to slow down the shoot growth when you grow the shoot in a downward direction. When you do it on a VSP, you grow vertically. Those shoots are sort of accelerating upward faster, in fact. So it does create, it increases the vigor somewhat, just because of the apical dominance or the hormone gradient that is in that shoot. Does that clarify that enough?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Let's see here. Do you? I just want to ask our speakers. Do you three have time to stick around a little bit longer? We've run over on our time, which is fine. We don't have to stop right now unless you guys need to go. So let me know what. Are you guys available to stick around?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Then we'll keep going with questions. Mike asked if any of you have thoughts on Cab Franc, whether you would pick VSP or top wire.
Okay, Cab Franc, that's not exactly a Northern Grapes variety. So,
I was thinking about that. I was just reading questions.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, here in the Finger Lakes, we note that this is a variety that tends to be very vigorous, and some of our soils are very vigorous. So so a lot of growers around here have had success with the vertically divided Scott Henry. So it is like a, you know, you have two fruiting wires like John showed, and in one portion of the canopy you train downward. You tend to put the wires a little higher, like maybe 36, 38 inches instead of 30 inches, so that you have room for that downward pointing canopy. But they train part of it down and part of it up, and that way they're able to accommodate the vigor and get essentially, you know, 1.7 times the canopy exposure. And I have some wonderful photos of this too. And then that really opens up the fruiting zone. So that's sort of what we like here in the Finger Lakes for vigorous vines of Cabernet Franc, is not the VSP, because that tends to be too crowded and too vigorous. Not the top wire Cordon, because they do still want to grow up, but this divided canopy that where you have half of the shoots going down and half the shoots going up.
Okay.
And all of it here in the Finger Lakes is cane pruned.
Okay. David asked if anybody has used electric fences around the vineyard to reduce predation. If any of you guys who are listening in want to comment about that in the chat pod, that would be good. John and Bob, have either of you used electric fences?
I have in Minnesota here a little bit. It's, if you're going to keep raccoons from coming in, for example, there's different fences. You could string some simple you know, electric fence wire that you would do in a farm situation. But you got the biggest trouble is keeping that thing tight enough and keeping the grass clean underneath it so it doesn't short out. So that's tricky. But if you've got maybe 2 or 3 pretty closely laid fence or wires from the ground up till about 1.5 foot or 2 feet, you won't get raccoons coming through there too easily. Otherwise, they also make sort of a sheep net or a sheep fence that's woven, and that's a little bit taller. But it does take a long time to install these fences to protect. So if you got a huge acreage, it's a pretty big perimeter to enclose, and then it takes a lot of energy to electrify that at the same time. But yeah, if you got a lot of problem, you're going to want to do something.
Yeah, I don't have any experience with that. It looked like a lot of expense and a lot of maintenance to me, and so far I've been able to avoid the need to do that.
You can also put out live traps if you wish, and get rid of a certain amount of raccoons that way.
That's what I do. And, you know, I went to the high wire, which gets the fruit up off the ground, and then I put around the perimeter of the vineyard a lot of live traps.
Okay. Paul asked, Bob, what do you do to increase berry size in Frontenac?
Well, I don't do anything. I take what I get. So, you know, I've been waiting for the vines to get mature enough to really figure out what kind of crop load I can attain sustainably and have good ripening and good vine growth the following year. So I'm kind of zeroing in on that 7 to 8 tons per acre, but I don't do anything specifically for berry size.
Okay. All right. Tom asked, is there a method to net for bees? He apparently has a pretty big problem with bees.
No.
Okay. That's what I assumed. So unless you found a really, really fine mesh, but I would guess that would be crazy expensive. So anyway, Susan asked, and I think this question is for John, on slides 23 and 61, are these just your general rules of thumb regardless of trellis type? The drawing looks like 18 shoots total on a vine. Each shoot has 15 plus nodes and 4.5 feet. Is she understanding this correctly?
Yeah, that's just a general, you know, I was just fitting that on a drawing. So that's by no means a one-size-fits-all for every single vine out there. That was just to illustrate some pictures on where to fit those shoots, essentially. But if you've got your vine spaced farther apart, you can fit more shoots in that space. I guess a general rule of thumb is somewhere in that range of 4 to 6 shoots per foot of trellis, maybe even a little bit more on some of the hybrids. I mean, you can, that's what leads to an open canopy. So if you got vines that are, you know, 6 feet, and then you're thinking about 6 shoots per every foot, well, 6 times 6, you're at the 36 or 40 shoots on a single vine like that. And of course, if you go further than that, then you're pushing. If you're an 8-foot vine, then you're looking at more like maybe up to 50 or even towards 60 shoots on that vine, right?
All right. We have one last question. Michael asked, what type of sprayer are you using on the Geneva double curtain system? Bob, I assume that question would be for you.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
What type of sprayer are you using with your Geneva double curtain system?
I use an air blast sprayer, 3-point mounted, and it's, you know, I've actually modified it so it has a higher chute that sprays down on the top of the canopy and down into the middle of the canopy.
All right. Tim, there was one more question that came in from Dave that I think you can answer. The umbrella Nipson system training canes, does this imply that you would have only 15 clusters if having 5 canes with 2 to 3 clusters per cane?
No, not at all. It's basically if you have 4 canes going out and you don't have cordons, basically your canes come from the head area of the vine, right in the center, right above the trunks, and each one of those canes is going to have 10 or 12 nodes. So basically, what you have in terms of fruiting buds is, you know, again with 4 canes, 10 buds per each cane, you're going to have 40 shoots that will bear clusters. So it's more or less equivalent, and the key item is how many buds you leave on the vine when you prune.
Yes. One final question. Tim O'Brien asked, does bird netting interfere with sun exposure to the clusters?
That's a good one. And I think the answer has to be yes, especially with dense bird netting. How much is an open question, but for most of the people that use bird netting, it's a choice between putting on the bird netting and having some fruit, and not putting it on and not having any fruit. So that kind of trumps the light exposure problem.
Right. There's different thicknesses on the netting, so a wider square, you know, is going to be less shading. So, you know, I think we have a pretty wide type of a squared net, and it's that extruded black is what we generally use. It breaks down in the sun in a couple of years, but it's a fairly cheap one, and it doesn't cover. I mean, it's hardly affecting any kind of light inception. Still, the fruit is getting very nice light exposure after netting.
Yeah. Well, on Long Island, that type of net doesn't work anymore for them, and so they've gone to very fine mesh, and so I would assume that intercepts some more of the sunlight.
All right. Well, guys, we have answered all the questions, so thank you for that. Thank you for sticking around 15 minutes past our scheduled time. Thank you, Tim, John, and Bob, for excellent presentations and sharing your knowledge. I think this was a great session. We had 135 people on at our highest time, so that's exciting to be able to reach that many people via the internet at one time. Let's see here. I also just posted a link to our webinar valuation survey. We're doing something a little bit different than our normal post-webinar surveys. We're trying to place a value on the webinar surveys to use for reporting purposes. So if you could go take that survey, we would greatly appreciate your response.